The wind was never in a rush, yet it whispered endlessly across the white-draped hills of the Viking north, soft as breath and slow as memory, brushing past thick wooden walls and snow-laden thatched roofs, where inside, the world seemed to slow down into a quiet rhythm of survival and stillness. As you ease into this journey, take a moment to close your eyes, relax your shoulders, and let go of the day that brought you here. You've arrived at the right place. This isn't a tale of battles and glory, but of muffled footsteps in the snow, the quiet warmth of fire-lit halls, and the peaceful monotony of Viking winter routines. This is a story to rest your mind, a slow unraveling of a world covered in snow and silence. If you find comfort in the calm and enjoy drifting off to sleepy stories from the past, consider subscribing to this channel, where history winds down with you every night. Your support lets us keep bringing you these soothing stories from long ago. Imagine the Nordic sky, deep gray and faintly blue, pressing low over the fjords and forests. The sun barely rises, offering only a dim glow before retreating again into night. The winters here are long, not measured in weeks or even months, but in the way time bends under heavy snow and endless darkness. It is not cold and harsh. It is freezing in the way of old bones and slow lives. In Viking villages tucked between mountains and frozen shorelines, people did not rush. Rushing was for summer. Winter was for waiting. It was for routines that never needed excitement. As our story begins, picture yourself entering a small timber longhouse, its door wrapped with animal hide to block the wind. A faint orange glow flickers from within, and the air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and dried fish. You are safe here. Nothing urgent ever happens here, only the soft tasks of living through snow. Each morning begins in the dark, for the sun is more rumor than reality. The fire, always kept alive through the night, is gently stirred back into flame. No one speaks at first. The voices of the household are preserved like everything else in winter, used sparingly. A woman wraps a thick cloak around her shoulders and begins grinding barley by the hearth, the rhythmic turning of stone on stone as ancient as the ground beneath. A child pokes at the embers with a stick carved by their grandfather. A man sharpens a bone needle, not because it is dull, but because there is time, and that is what time is for. These are not moments to rush through. They stretch like wool being spun into long threads. Outside, the world is hushed. Snow falls in flakes so large and slow, they seem to hover in place, drifting without urgency. A path is cleared from the house to the byre, where animals are checked. Goats huddle together for warmth. Cows blink slowly in the dim. The same hands that built ships now carry buckets of warm mash for livestock, not with strength, but with steadiness. The winters taught patience more than strength. The cold humbled even the proudest warrior, turning spears into hayforks, helmets into woolen caps. Food is simple and honest. A bowl of porridge sweetened with preserved berries, dried fish soaked overnight, then simmered with onions from last year's harvest. Each meal is a quiet affair, taken slowly, not out of ceremony, but because the days are long and slow. Conversation is not loud. It is folded between silences, like seams in a winter tunic. People speak of the weather, not because it changes, but because it doesn't. The sameness is comforting. The predictability is restful. Children play with carved wooden toys, their laughter muffled by thick fur mittens and heavy wool tunics. They make tracks in the snow, pretend to hunt seals or chase bears, their games drawn from stories told by the fire. The elders sit nearby, wrapped in layers, sometimes speaking, more often just listening to the crackle of the fire and the breathing of the house. A Viking winter was not just cold. It was deep. It asked people to sink into it, to match its pace, to become part of its slow unfolding. Evenings come without fanfare. Lamps filled with fish oil cast dim halos on the walls, and the same stories are told once more, not because they are forgotten, but because they are remembered differently in winter. A tale about a sea journey sounds like a dream when heard under snow. The listeners do not interrupt. They do not need to. Each pause is understood. Each silence has meaning. As the night stretches on, the house becomes quieter. Children are laid to sleep under layers of furs. The fire is tucked in with care, coals buried to hold their heat until morning. And then the house breathes in unison, deep, slow, quiet. No one is in a hurry for the morning, because the morning is only a slightly lighter shade of night. The snow outside continues its descent, softening the roof, the path, the world. Nothing threatens. Nothing demands attention. It is a good night for forgetting time. Somewhere, a dog shifts in its sleep, a soft thump as its tail brushes the wooden wall. A wind gust rattles the thatch, but the house holds. Viking homes were built to endure not storms of swords, but storms of silence. In the stillness, you can feel the weight of the season pressing gently down, not heavy, but full, like a thick blanket over a sleeping village. And in this weight, there is peace. If you're still with us, drifting slowly with each word, you've already begun to feel it, that gentle pull into a slower world. That's what we're here for. So let yourself go deeper. Let the snow keep falling. Let the fire keep crackling. And allow the rhythm of forgotten winters to carry you just a little further from today. The snow did not fall with urgency, nor did it cease to fall. It was simply there, ever present, as a quiet curtain between the Viking world and everything else. By now, the light of the winter sun had become something of a suggestion rather than a fact, rising only slightly above the horizon before slipping back into dusk. The villagers, long accustomed to such abbreviated days, moved through their hours with a soft and thoughtful pace, like a boat gently drifting through a fog-bound fjord. No task was rushed. No sound was sharp. Time had surrendered to the season, and the people followed suit. Inside the longhouse, life continued in the dim glow of the hearth, where shadows danced slowly on the timber beams, and the crackling fire offered the only measure of passing time. These were the hours that filled the Viking winter, slow, repetitive, familiar, and in their stillness lay their comfort. The longhouse itself was more than a building. It was the center of everything. Thick wooden beams, hand-hewn and blackened by years of smoke, framed the structure. The walls were insulated with mud and straw, the floors lined with rushes or animal hides, renewed each season. Everything smelled of wood smoke, wool, dried herbs, and warm skin. It was not an unpleasant scent, just earthy, lived in, familiar. During the deep winters, this one hall held generations. Children chasing soft echoes, elders watching with tired smiles, mothers plucking feathers from birds to stuff into. Garments, fathers mending worn handles on tools dulled by use. No one had a corner to themselves, yet there was a private rhythm to the space, an invisible choreography of movement and pause, silence and murmur, duty and rest out by mid-morning. If such a term could apply in a world barely touched by light, the house had warmed slightly, enough that outer cloaks could be removed. Still bundled in layers, the inhabitants tended to the day's unchanging rituals. The spindle whirred in the hands of a patient woman. A boy fetched more firewood, his boots crunching against packed snow. Two elderly men sat side by side, carving. Spoons, not speaking, each motion an echo of decades of winters past. The repetition of tasks was not a burden. It was a kind of quiet music, one that allowed the mind to float gently without effort. In the world beyond the longhouse, the snow deepened and the sky remained stubbornly colorless. But inside, there was continuity, and within continuity, there was peace, Sometimes a visitor would arrive, a cousin from the next settlement, a traveler delayed by the weather, or a shepherd whose flock needed shelter near warmer barns. Their knock at the heavy door was never urgent. Guests arrived slowly and left even slower. Hospitality was sacred, especially in the frozen months. A guest would be greeted with a bowl of broth, thick with root vegetables and strips of preserved meat, handed a dry cloak, and offered a spot by the fire. Stories were exchanged, quietly and gradually, as if unrolling parchment one careful inch. At a time, there was no rush to tell, no rush to listen. Every tale settled like fresh snow over the room. Children, when not sleeping or helping with chores, listened to these stories with wide eyes. Tales of frost giants, sea serpents, and distant battles fought in greener months. But even these fantastical accounts were told in soft tones, drawn out slowly, with long pauses and gentle cadences. The rhythm of storytelling was less about climax and more about comfort. It was a way of filling the room with gentle purpose, like a lullaby spoken instead of sung. And always the fire crackled on. Even in a place so still, there was a kind of movement, the slow churn of food preparation, the grinding of seeds, the melting of snow for drinking water, the checking of stored fish in hanging racks. These were winter labors, modest but essential. The Vikings did not thrive in winter. They endured it with quiet skill. Their strength was not loud, but persistent. A different kind of courage, one that dressed itself in layers of patience and gore. The cold with steady hands dot as afternoon dimmed back into night, a transition more sensed than seen. The family gathered close once more. Oil lamps were lit, carefully trimmed to avoid waste. Someone might hum an old melody, low and wordless, just enough to remind the room of its shared memory. The weaving would continue, the mending would progress, and still the snow would fall. It never hurried, and neither did they. Outside, the world grew wider. Inside, it grew warmer. Meals were simpler in winter. Stored grains, dried meats, and root vegetables pulled from underground stores where they'd been buried to keep the frost away. Every bite was a whisper from summer, now long gone. The meals were not meant to delight, but to sustain, and their quiet preparation was just another verse in the ongoing lullaby of the Viking household. At times, dried herbs were boiled, not just for taste, but for warmth. Thyme and juniper to soothe the breath, chamomile to calm the body. These small comforts, passed from hand to hand, were the real treasures of winter. Sleep came early, not because of fatigue, but because night was long and dreams were generous. Beds were shared for warmth, a tangle of children, grandparents, cousins, all tucked beneath layers of fur and woven wool. Stories lingered in the air like smoke, drifting upward into the beams where the day's quiet moments became the night's gentle echoes. And above it all, the roof held firm, thick with snow but unbowed, keeping in the warmth and keeping out the endless sky. As the fire burned lower, the house slowed even further. Breath became the dominant sound, soft and steady. The world had narrowed down to this one room, this one breath, this one quiet period. Nothing more was needed. Nothing more was expected. The Viking winter had a way of simplifying everything, turning days into long moments, and moments into rest. And still the snow continued, slow and soft and without end, like the story itself. If you're still awake, listening to the hush of this world and the soft crackle of the firelight, then let your thoughts fade into the snowdrifts. Let your body grow heavy, your mind grow light, and drift with us deeper into the gentle stillness of the north. The silence in a Viking winter was not emptiness, it was fullness, wrapped in layers of snow and time, filling every crevice of the day with a softness that required no response. There was a stillness in the frozen landscape that resonated deep within the people who lived there. not as something foreign or feared, but as something familiar, expected, even welcome. The snow-covered hills, the distant frost-bound trees, and the slow drift of ice along the frozen rivers formed not merely a background, but a rhythm, one that the villagers matched without question. Each breath taken indoors echoed the breath of the landscape outside. Each motion, no matter how minor, was shaped by cold and quiet. As another day settled gently into its place, the villagers once again found themselves repeating patterns they'd known for generations, not as burdens, but as the calm heartbeat of winter survival. Morning began, if it could be called morning, with the rekindling of the fire. Coals hidden beneath ash were brought to life with dry moss and kindling, producing a soft orange glow that slowly warmed the hearthstones. A pot of snow, collected the day before, was placed nearby to melt, yielding water for the first tasks of the day. The same woman who had stirred the fire yesterday stirred it again, her wool sleeves trailing like shadowy threads in the flickering light. A quiet exchange, a nod, a glance, was all that passed between her and the man who emerged from the bed platform nearby, dragging a fur pelt behind him like a tale of forgotten dreams. Words were not needed. Their routine was deeper than dialogue. Outside the house, a soft snowfall persisted, adding yet another fine layer to the heavy white world. The door, covered in animal hide, was pushed open briefly to let out the stale breath of the house and let in the frozen breath of the land. A few snowflakes drifted in, landing silently on woolen cloaks and wooden beams before vanishing without fuss. A teenage boy volunteered to walk to the food storehouse, a separate structure dug deep into the snow-covered ground. He wrapped himself in his thickest cloak, took the wooden snowshoes from the wall, and left without ceremony. There was no thrill in the errand, no excitement in the act. It was simply a part of the winter rhythm. The snow creaked underfoot, and the cold kissed his face with its familiar bite. Inside, the day unfolded in small, gentle tasks. Wool was carded and spun, the fibers drawn slowly through calloused fingers. A younger child traced lines in the eye. Frost on the wooden wall with the tip of her finger, lost in thought. One of the older men mended a wooden bowl with a sliver of bone, murmuring to himself in a voice so low it might have been prayer or memory or both. These were not idle acts. They were threads that held the season together. Each task brought a sense of time passing, not in leaps or bounds, but in slow turns, like the great grinding gears of a sunless clock. Around midday, if such a word had meaning, a pot of stew was set on the fire. Barley, dried fish, and a handful of turnips made up the meal. The scent spread gradually, not strong, but earthy and grounding. As the pot simmered, someone told a story about a snow spirit who wandered between houses looking for misplaced mittens. The children listened without interrupting, eyes half closed. The voice of the storyteller was slow and smooth, curling through the air like smoke, the kind of voice meant to be heard while lying beneath thick blankets and watching the firelight flicker. The story didn't end so much as fade. A pause, a long silence, a soft sigh, and then it was simply over, as if it had never needed an ending. Afternoon, indistinguishable from morning or night, carried on with its soft progression. More firewood was stacked by the hearth. A bundle of reeds was brought in to begin weaving a new mat for the entryway. The work was done in pairs, hands moving in unison, not hurried, not idle. Someone began to hum an old melody, and the tune drifted among the rafters for a time before settling into the floorboards. There was something sacred in these mundane repetitions, a kind of shared endurance, a communal meditation that bound them more tightly than any oath or ceremony ever. Could as the light faded, or rather, as the gray dimmed further into deeper gray, the household shifted once more. Dinner was even simpler than midday stew. Bread baked days before, now warmed by the fire, paired with hard cheese and pickled roots. It was eaten slowly, without discussion, each bite taken with a mindfulness born not of intention, but of custom. The sound of chewing, the creak of wooden cups, the occasional cough, these were the sounds of winter conversation. They filled the room more than words ever could dot after the meal. The family huddled together again. The children were tucked beneath shared furs, the smallest ones falling asleep in the crook of their mother's arm, while older ones listened to another story, this one older, about the time when the sun vanished for 100 days, and a clever fox lit a torch to find it again. The storyteller's voice was soft, measured, and sleep-warmed. Outside, the snow thickened. It layered onto rooftops, settled into tree branches, and muffled the world into softness. Inside, eyes blinked slowly, bodies grew heavier, and breath became the only measure of time. Soon, the house became a cocoon of heat and fur and dreams. The fire was banked once again, its light lowered until it was just enough to paint faint orange streaks across the faces of those still awake. The hush was complete. The weight of the snow above, the warmth of the family below, and the silence of the hour created a balance so complete that even thoughts moved more slowly. The winter didn't ask questions. It only offered rest. Long, gentle, uninterrupted. Rest. And so, the house slept. Not all at once, but piece by piece. First the youngest, then the weary, then even the restless. Dreams drifted upward like wood smoke, curling into the dark corners of the rafters. Outside, the snow continued, without end, without hurry, and sound. The snow had grown thicker overnight, blanketing every roof, every path, and every tree limb with an added layer of quiet. The sound outside had become less like silence and more like the absence of interruption, a soft hum of winter that surrounded the Viking settlement like a lullaby without music. From the longhouse, little could be seen beyond the walls of white, and yet there was no sense of isolation. To the people here, this was normal, expected, even welcome. The snow was not an intruder. It was part of the home. It crept into the eaves, softened every sound, and curled itself around every timber like a patient visitor who had no reason to leave. Inside, the rhythm of winter continued, just as it always had, slow and unchanging, held together by the rituals of survival and the warmth of routine. When the hearth was stirred that morning, the embers responded slowly, like memories being asked to wake before they were ready. A few sparks caught on to dry moss, and soon the flames rose again, not with haste, but with familiarity. Around the fire, the house gradually came to life. A wooden ladle clinked against a pot. Woolen feet shuffled across the packed earth floor. A soft cough broke the silence before retreating again into quiet. The morning was dark, but not unpleasant. No one looked outside. They already knew what was there. Snow. Always snow. A landscape that changed without changing. But inside, the warmth built steadily, breath by breath, fire by fire. One of the older women began sorting dried herbs kept in small stitched pouches hanging from the rafters. Each pouch held the soft scent of summer, now distant and fragile. She ground a few leaves between her fingers, adding some to the cooking pot, others to a woolen cloth that would be placed over a sleeping child's chest. The herbs weren't powerful, but they were comforting. And in a winter so long and still, comfort was as important as food. Next to her, a young girl carefully arranged carved wooden charms on a shelf, not because they were needed, but because their presence was part of the house. They had always been there, symbols of protection, of memory, of continuity. The day's work was not assigned. It simply began. Each person knew their task without needing instruction. The man who tended the goats took his usual walk to the small stable brushing snow off the door and patting each animal on the head. Their warm breath fogged the air inside the barn, a little world of heat and hay. He refilled their trough with stored grain mash, whispering something to one of the older goats as he worked. It was not a job done with purpose, but with presence. The goats did not care for words, but they knew the sound of his voice. They knew the steadiness of his steps. Back in the longhouse, a group of children worked with a woman to patch worn boots. They passed thread and bone needles back and forth, giggling softly as they worked. A fire snapped behind them, casting long shadows along the walls. A kettle whistled gently from the edge of the hearth, filled with a tea of dried linden flowers and a hint of honeycomb. This was not a time for doing things quickly. It was a time for doing them carefully, with hands that understood the rhythm of winter and the need for slowness. When a distant howl rose from beyond the village, the voice of a lone wolf, perhaps, or just the shifting of ice in the wind. No one flinched. These sounds were part of the music of the season, the same song every year. A lullaby, rough around the edges, but known by heart. The children glanced at the door, curious but unafraid. The old man near the fire simply nodded once, then returned to carving a chest-like game piece from bone. It would take him many days to finish, but he was in no rush. Winter allowed for such things. Projects without urgency, stories without endings, days without clocks. Food was prepared again at midday. A flatbread made from barley and rye, warmed over the fire and rubbed with garlic. Pickled roots shared from a ceramic jar. Salted lamb, shaved thin and passed carefully from hand to hand. There was a calmness in the meal, not because of fullness, but because of sharing. Every bite reminded them of preparation done in earlier seasons, summer labor stored in winter jars. The meal was as much about memory as it was about sustenance. After eating, the villagers returned to their silence. Some slept, others worked. A mother sang to her child in a voice low and steady, not to entertain, but to soothe. A teenage boy sat near the door, carefully scraping the ice from a piece of antler, crafting it into a hook or tool or trinket. He hadn't decided. It didn't matter. The making was what mattered. The process, not the product. And still, the snow fell. It was no longer noticed, like breath, like a heartbeat. Like time itself. By early evening, a faint blush of color appeared in the western sky. Not a sunset, but something like the idea of a sunset. The clouds had parted just enough for a streak of pale orange to show through, and for a moment, everyone paused. Not in awe, but in recognition. It was the sky's way of reminding them that the sun still existed, even if only as a memory. One of the women stepped outside and stood there a while, letting the snow fall gently into her hair. She looked upward, not expecting warmth, but accepting beauty. Then she returned inside, shaking snow from her shoulders, and whispered a few words to no one in particular. A fire answered with a soft pop. Night returned without event. Lamps were lit once more, and fish oil was added carefully to the clay vessels to keep them burning slowly and low. The household returned to the hearth, wrapped again in the shared heat of one another's company. A child asked for the story of the ice fox again, the one who could run across frozen lakes without ever cracking the surface. The story was told not with flair, but with warmth. Every pause is important as every word. In the story, the fox always disappears into the mist at the end, and when the tale finished, no one spoke. They didn't need to. Sleep returned gradually. Like mist creeping into a valley, it settled over the longhouse in layers. First over the children, then the elders, the fire itself, its flames reduced to a slow heartbeat. The snow outside had ceased for now, leaving behind a world hushed and heavy. The house sighed beneath its blankets of fur and time itself folded inwards like a closing bloom. The longhouse did not wake all at once. It stirred gradually as warmth returned to the air and breath condensed softly in the morning cold. A child shifted beneath a woolen blanket. A fire gave its first gentle crackle after being coaxed back to life. There was no sudden noise, no rushing footsteps, no burst of light, only the slow blooming of another winter day, like a heavy curtain being pulled back just an inch. The snow still lay thick over the roof, compressing sound and dimming the world outside. The darkness of night had merely deepened into the darkness of day, and all movement followed its slow command. No voices rose above a murmur. No action broke the calm. In the Viking North, winter had no interest in hurry, and neither did those who lived within its endless frost. A woman rose first and checked the ash pile for the faint glow of embers from the night before. Her fingers worked with quiet precision, stacking dry bark and slivers of wood, shielding the kindling from the draft as she breathed life into the fire. One of the children awoke next, rubbing sleep from his eyes and reaching blindly for the thick socks placed near his bedding. The floor was cold, but it was a familiar cold, expected, not jarring. Soon, others joined them in the quiet procession of the morning, each person slipping into the rhythm of the day without needing instruction or signal. They moved as if within a dream, slow, assured, and unbothered by time. A pot was filled with snow and set on the stones to melt, while another was stirred. Last night's stew now warmed again for breakfast. The smell was earthy, a mix of onion, dried herbs, and smoked fish. It wasn't the kind of scent that excited hunger, but the kind that signaled comfort, tradition, and the reassurance of routine. As the longhouse warmed, more bodies emerged from their furs and joined the circle around the hearth. Conversation remained sparse, not out of silence, but out of understanding. Everyone already knew what the day would bring outside. The snow had stopped. A dull gray sky stretched above the frozen village, and the wind had quieted, leaving the world untouched since the evening before. The trees stood coated in white, unmoving. A few distant crows shifted on a bare branch, their presence noted by the older man seated near the doorway, who murmured a soft greeting in their direction, as if continuing a decades-old conversation. He remained there for some time, watching the way the wind moved. Nothing at all. Dot work began slowly. Boots were repaired with sinew thread. A cracked wooden bowl was patched with beeswax and ash. Someone set to weaving new rope from dried grass, not because it was urgently needed, but because making rope was always a good use of time in winter. The motions were repetitive, gentle, and perfect for sharing space with others. Hands worked, mouths remained mostly still. Only now and then did a voice break the silence with a short observation or a remembered joke, causing a slow smile to ripple across a few faces before fading again into the quiet. One of the older women brought down a bundle of dried herbs wrapped in linen. She began steeping them for tea, the warmth of the steam rising gently into the beams overhead. The scent of mint, yarrow, and pine needles filled the air. A child, recovering from a persistent winter cough, leaned into the vapors with closed eyes. The herbs didn't heal with force. They soothed gradually, like all things in this season. Nothing changed quickly in the North Dot as midday arrived, if the slight shift in light could be called that. The snow began to fall again, not heavily, just enough to remind them that it had never truly stopped. The flakes floated like ash, settling on the already buried world. Through the small opening in the wall, they could see it drift, thick and endless. No one reacted. It was as if the sky had exhaled and the world responded by simply accepting its offering. Food was taken slowly. Warm grain porridge, a handful of dried berries, and thin slices of smoked reindeer meat. A silence settled during the meal, not as a rule, but as a shared practice. Eating was not rushed. It was a moment to be still. Afterward, some napped, wrapped in furs, their breath forming small clouds in the cooler corners of the longhouse. Others simply sat, sharpening a knife, repairing a mitten, staring into the fire as if listening to an old friend speak from within the flames. Later in the afternoon, two of the young men strapped on snowshoes and made their way beyond the longhouse, checking the traps set along the edge of the forest. Their movements were careful, deliberate, and quiet. Every step was muffled by snow. They spoke in low voices, exchanging a few words. They passed frozen trees, still streams, and the faint trail of a fox that had moved through during the night. The traps yielded little, a single rabbit, and evidence of others disturbed. But that was expected. Winter did not offer much. It only offered enough. They returned just as the light faded again into dusk, brushing snow from their cloaks and offering the catch to the woman at the fire without fanfare. She thanked them with a nod and hung the animal to prepare later. No celebration, no disappointment, just continuity. That was the language of the Viking winter. Not excitement, not despair. Just one day following another in a steady, unbroken patterned dot. As evening settled, the house grew warm once more. Shadows stretched across the low ceiling, dancing with the firelight. A quiet game was played with carved tokens and marked wood, the players moving slowly, neither trying too hard to win. Children curled around the fire, now lulled not by exhaustion, but by the rhythm of familiarity. A sane story might be told. Again tonight, or maybe a new one. But either way, the voices would be calm and the pauses long. And so, as night took hold, the longhouse folded in on itself once more. A house full of dreams, of warmth, of slow breath and softer thoughts. The wind whispered against the walls like it always did. The snow continued to fall like it always had. And everything, from the fire's glow to the hush of sleep, remained just as it should be, unchanging, gentle. And still, even in the deepest part of the season, when the days became indiscernible from the nights, and the sky seemed reluctant to show even the faintest glow, life in the Viking longhouse continued with a pace as steady as breath. There was no sense of urgency, no anticipation of change, only the comfort of knowing what each moment required. A quiet, dependable unfolding of hours spent close to firelight, wrapped in wool, surrounded by the low murmur of shared existence. The world outside was blanketed in stillness. The snow piled so high against the outer walls that only the tops of fences and roof beams peeked out from under the white. But inside, the warmth of habit remained, glowing as gently as the embers that never allowed themselves to fully sleep. A woman knelt by the fire, coaxing heat from coals with practiced hands, her fingers knowing every movement without thought. She layered thin slivers of birch bark beneath a stack of pine, arranging them like a quiet ceremony. Across the room, a man stretched, rolling his shoulders beneath his heavy tunic before reaching for a worn knife, its wooden handle smoothed. From years of use, no one rushed, no one ever did. Winter asked for steadiness, not speed, and every gesture obeyed that unwritten rule. In a corner of the house, a baby murmured in their sleep, their breath a tiny rhythm barely louder than the fire's size. The door creaked slightly on its leather hinges as someone stepped out, careful not to disturb the packed snow too much as they fetched water from the nearest melt pot. The sky was thick with pale clouds, heavy and unmoving. There would be no sun today, nor any reason to look for it. A crow caught once from a rooftop beam and flew away, its wings scattering a light dusting of frost from the eaves. The air smelled of wood smoke and frozen pine, a scent so familiar it barely registered anymore. Inside, the rhythm of the day took shape once again. A small loom was unwrapped from the wall, and its soft creaking soon filled the air as thread was pulled and pressed. A boy and a girl worked together to prepare lengths of wool for dyeing, carefully separating the strands, their hands red from the cold, but their faces calm. An elder offered occasional advice from a blanket-draped seat, her voice low and slow, like honey moving in a wooden bowl. Every word held the weight of remembered winters and long-ago mornings, just like this one. When the weaving was set aside, others began gathering herbs and bark for tinctures. A carved bowl was filled with snow and set beside the fire to melt. Into clean water, into which slivers of willow and dried linden were added. These small concoctions were part of the season's quiet resilience, a way to soothe coughs, ease fevers, or simply warm a weary body. The liquid was poured into wooden cups and passed from hand to hand, each person pausing just briefly to sip, breathe, and return to silence. Occasionally, someone would speak of dreams, of ships gliding silently through icy waters, of forests, blanketed in endless green, of animals no longer seen in the white landscape. These stories, though small, became a form of warmth, not just entertainment, but preservation of identity, memory, and meaning. In a world so frozen, stories stayed fluid. They helped time keep moving, even when the world around them had forgotten how the midday meal was a shared effort. Root vegetables were chopped with slow precision, added to a thick broth stirred from morning until now. A slab of dried meat was rehydrated and shredded into the pot, and herbs were sprinkled from a hand-carved box. The scent of simmering stew was enough to draw sleepy smiles, but no one expressed excitement aloud. Contentment here did not shout. It exhaled. When the food was finally ladled into wooden bowls, the room quieted once more, each spoonful taken with care. Some leaned back afterward, eyes half closed, as though the meal had reminded them how to rest even more deeply in the quiet that followed. Some took to mending tools, others to fixing woven baskets or smoothing worn spots on boots. One of the younger boys shaped a bird from driftwood, carving its beak just so, while an older man silently watched and nodded, approving the angle of the wings. These small acts of creation, shared and repeated, were like footprints in snow, subtle but lasting. They marked the passage of the day as evening returned, not sharply, but gradually, like a dimming candle. Oil lamps were lit and tucked into wall brackets made of bent antlers. Their glow cast amber waves across the beams and fur-lined benches, catching in the eyes of those who sat closest. Children curled around one another, their cheeks flushed with heat from the fire, and their hands tucked into sleeves. The grown-ups gathered nearer as well, their conversations even slower now, their bodies sinking into the comfort of habit and the weight of woolen cloaks. And once again, the stories came, not with fanfare, but with familiarity. A tale of a winter so long it froze a waterfall mid-drop. Another of a boy who followed a reindeer into the forest and returned with snow in his hair and a secret in his heart. The listeners did not stir. They barely blinked. The storyteller's voice flowed with the rhythm of snow, soft, steady, and endless. By the time the story faded, half the room had slipped into sleep, and the other half was almost there. Fire burned low, its last flames curling into deep red coals. Someone banked it with ash and tucked the remaining wood beneath a fur-lined bench for the morning. Then, one by one, they all settled into blankets, into dreams, into the gentle weight of another night that looked no different from the one before. Outside, the snow resumed, light as breath, fine as dust, layering the world in softness. The longhouse did not resist it. It welcomed the hush, the calm, the continuation of a winter that asked only one thing: to be still, and to last the days blurred gently in the longhouse, as if stitched together by threads of smoke and snow, indistinct yet whole. No one counted. Them in the traditional sense. There were no calendars to mark their passing, no clock to chime the hour. Time passed through the house, not in minutes or days, but in the deepening of snowdrifts, the thickening of firs, and the soft creak of beams settling further under winter's weight. Morning looked like evening, and midday like twilight. But the people did not mind. Their lives had always bent to the shape of the season, like a branch heavy with frost. Inside the longhouse, the only constant was warmth, the warmth of the hearth, of shared stories and human presence in a world wrapped in ice. On this day, the fire sparked a little slower, and even the oldest hands took a bit longer to stir it into life. It was colder than usual. Not dangerous, just deeper, the kind of cold that made the walls moan softly in the early hours and pressed frost into the corners of window slits. Still, the house responded in its usual way. A shawl was pulled tighter. A second pot was hung above the fire to melt snow. Woolen mittens were brought down from pegs and passed from one sleepy hand to another. Each movement was deliberate, each action a quiet continuation of what had always been done. A group of women gathered near the fire to work on a larger project, a tapestry that had been slowly forming over several winters. Spread across a broad frame, it depicted a reindeer hunt in vivid woolen threads, reds, browns, and grays that mirrored the land in warmer seasons. Though only a few stitches were added each day, it was never considered incomplete. It simply grew in time with the snow. The youngest girl in the group threaded her needle slowly, pausing between each pull to listen to the quiet, her small hands imitating those of her mother beside her. Nothing needed to be said. The story was in stitches. In another part of the house, a boy practiced making fire with flint and steel, striking carefully, watching each spark fall and vanish. He wasn't asked to do this. He simply wanted to. The adults let him try, watching from the corners of their eyes, occasionally, offering a nod of encouragement. In winter, such efforts were never wasted. Even small tasks taught patience, and patience was the strongest skill in a place where change came like the slow drip of thawing ice. Later, the air inside the house filled with the scent of pine tar and beeswax, as a man worked on sealing the edges of wooden balls. He dipped a rough cloth into the warm mixture and rubbed it slowly along the grain, his fingers moving with care. These bowls had been carved by his grandfather, not ornate, just sturdy, dependable, with the faint grooves. Of old use still visible. Keeping them intact was not just practical. It was my memory. The preservation of small things gave shape to the years. The years. Outside, the snow fell in thick, slow spirals, blanketing the landscape like a mother pulling furs over a sleeping child. No paths were visible. No movement disturbed the smooth surface. Even the birds had quieted. Only the wind made itself known, brushing against the longhouse walls with a sigh that never asked to be answered. Occasionally, someone would lift the hide curtain over the door to peek out, not to see anything new, but simply to confirm that the world still looked the way it should. White, soft, unchanged by mid-afternoon. A soft singing began, not for performance, but as a work song, its melody rising gently from a corner where two elders sat weaving thin cords from sinew and gut. The tune had no words. It was just a flow of vowel sounds, passed down through generations, shaped by repetition. A baby, lulled by the sound, fell asleep beside them, its tiny hand curled around a carved wooden spoon like a treasure. The song wove itself into the fabric of the day, threading through conversations, stitchings, and thoughts. The meal that evening was simple. Roasted barley bread brushed with tallow, onion soup thickened with beans, and a dried apple reconstituted in warm water and shared in slices among the children. The warmth of the food was mirrored by the ease of the conversation, low, soft, punctuated with laughter that never needed to rise above a whisper. A few heads nodded slowly as stories resumed. Tales of the frost stag, who leaves no tracks, and of the bear spirit who trades dreams for silence. These stories had no lessons. They were not warnings or parables. They simply existed, like the snow itself, something always present, always welcome. As the night approached again, oil lamps flickered against the walls, and the scent of burning lichen filled the air. The light they gave off was dim but kind, just enough to glow across the room, leaving the far corners in soft shadow. One by one, the villagers wrapped themselves in furs, each nest arranged carefully beside another. There were no separate rooms, no doors, just the shared rhythm of sleeping breath and the gentle rise and fall of dreams. The wind sang again in the thatch, joined by the groaning of the roof beams and the distant call of some unseen creature beyond the trees. But none of it disturbed the longhouse. Its people had heard these sounds before. They were not omens, they were lullabies. And so sleep returned, long, slow, and unbroken, curling through the wooden bones of the house like a second. Fire. The snow continued to fall, and the world remained soft and slow. The longhouse breathed as one. Beams, fire, fur, and flesh in harmony with the cold that blanketed the world outside. In a season where sunlight barely graced the land and shadows arrived before morning ever truly began, the Viking villagers did not resist the stillness. They leaned into it. Each breath taken within those timber-bird walls was drawn from centuries of knowing how to live with the snow, not against it. The world beyond was white, silent, and undisturbed, and so too was the mood within. Unhurried, deliberate, softened by the repetition of simple, necessary things. The fire rose and fell like a heartbeat. People stirred not because they were called, but because their bodies remembered when to move, when to work, and when to simply be still. This particular morning began with a ritual as old as the beams themselves, the inspection of tools. Blades dulled from bone cutting, hooks bent by winter's freeze, wooden handles worn smooth by years of use. All were brought to the center of the room and laid upon a fur rug beside the hearth. One by one, they were checked, sharpened, and repaired. The youngest children watched intently as an older man ran his thumb along the edge of a blade, testing its honesty. A whetstone passed hand to hand, and each scrape across metal echoed softly through the room, like a slow and quiet conversation. There was no rush, just the understanding that tools must outlast the season. Across the room, a woman sorted beads from a leather pouch, not gems, but carefully smoothed stones, carved bits of amber, tiny bones painted with dye. She wasn't making jewelry for decoration, but for marking. Each bead would find its place in a necklace meant to honor a memory. A mother gone in the last frost, a child born just before the ice set in. These weren't pieces to be worn daily. They were stored in carved wooden boxes, taken out when the snow melted and the land awoke. But in winter, the act of making was its kind of worship, slow, patient, and filled with meaning. Later in the morning, a man returned from checking the food stores, buried beneath the snow outside. He stomped the snow from his boots and gave a quiet nod, the only confirmation needed that all was well. Dried meats remained tightly wrapped. Root vegetables were untouched by frost. The salted fish, strung along rows of poles in a small adjacent shed, hung stiff and undisturbed. These checks were not ceremonial. They were survival, but they were done with the same reverence. Everything in winter was measured. Everything mattered. A young girl began brushing and reworking the family's fur cloaks. She laid them out by the fire, warmed her hands, and then smoothed the pelts with long, even strokes. The fur needed attention, not for appearance, but to keep its insulating power. She worked in silence, occasionally pressing her cheek against the fur to feel for warmth. Beside her, a younger brother played with small wooden animals, his fingers slowly walking a carved bear across a pretend hill made from rolled cloth. He didn't speak either. His game didn't need words. By midday, the light outside had grown brighter, not sunlight, but a kind of silvered gray that hinted at the world beyond the snow. It glowed against the snowdrifts and made the icicles hanging from the longhouse eaves glimmer faintly. Someone opened the door for a few minutes to air out the room, and for a brief time, cold air rushed in, sending ribbons of frost dancing above the fire before they disappeared. The air smelled clean, sharp, pure. When the door was closed again, the longhouse returned to its equilibrium. Warmer now, somehow, for the contrast. The meal was a stew today, richer than usual, with pieces of smoked venison, thick with barley and herbs stored from autumn. The pot had been tended since morning, and when it was finally served, there were no exclamations, only the sound of spoons on wooden bowls, the occasional sip, and the long, slow silence of shared satisfaction. After the meal, a few of the elders recited old proverbs, not loudly, not theatrically. Just soft statements floated into the air like ashes from the fire. A warm house is not built in a day. Snow listens more than it speaks. Even frozen rivers remember the sea. No one replied. They didn't need to. The afternoon was spent mending a net, an old fishing net, kept in the rafters, its knots loose from age, even though the rivers would remain frozen for weeks, maybe longer. The mending still had to be done. The fingers that worked the knots moved slowly, measuring each strand, working in rhythm. The children watched, and they took up their own, practicing loops. Patience was taught through repetition, not scolding. To be idle was never a sin, but to be careless was. In winter, attention was loved as dusk drew near. The fire was fed more generously, the heat rising into the rafters where drying herbs hung in orderly rows. Their scent mixed with the warmth, lavender, pine, smoke, and something faintly sweet like dried berries. The smell of the longhouse was always layered. The memory of meals, the breath of people and animals, the whisper of wood and wool. It was comforting, like wearing the same thick cloak every day and finding a new pocket you'd forgotten. Was there that evening brought the return of stories, some true, some not, and most something in between. One tale was of a woman who could speak to snowflakes, each one telling her a secret before melting in her hand. Another way of a boy who chased the northern lights into the mountains and came back with hair the color of ice. The listeners did not ask questions. They listened, then slept, their dreams folding into the stories like fabric into a chest. The fire dimmed, the lamps guttered, and the house quieted again. Outside, snow had begun to fall anew, heavier now in long diagonal, streaks that brushed against the roof and windows like a slow breath. Inside, no one stirred. The night had arrived, not to surprise, but to continue. The longhouse, wrapped in stillness, settled back into the rhythm of the deep north, where everything was slow, everything was steady, and everything always was. Waiting for spring dot, there was a wait to winter that could not be measured in snow or temperature. It was a heaviness of time itself, of stories passed down through silence, of chores inherited not through words, but through observation, and of patience shaped by the long, unchanging days of the frozen north. In the Viking longhouse, where the outside world was muffled under thick layers of snow, the hours moved with a slow and thoughtful rhythm. Each motion was deliberate, not each moment was quiet. A people here lived not in resistance to the season, but in harmony with its lull. They did not mark time by sun or shadow, but by the gradual fading and deepening of the fire's glow and the softness of breath against the cold morning air. The hearthstones had been warm through the night, And now, in the still gray of what passed for morning, someone gently uncovered the banked embers. A handful of dry moss and birch curls brought the fire back to life. Soon, the room began to hum again with the gentle sounds of awakening. The soft stirring of fur blankets, the low cough of an elder, the muted clink of a wooden ladle tapping against the rim of a pot. No one spoke loudly. No one moved quickly. The day would arrive when it was ready, and so the household waited together, already halfway into its rhythm without having spoken a single word. One of the young boys sat cross-legged near the fire, holding a chunk of soapstone and a dull iron knife. He was shaping the stone slowly, carefully, into something not yet named, perhaps a figurine, or a charm, or just a shape that felt good in the hand. Across from him, an older woman watched, nodding occasionally, her fingers moving. In the practiced rhythm of mending a tear in a wool tunic, she didn't instruct him. She didn't interrupt. She simply existed beside him, a living memory of how things were done, not by command, but by quiet example. Outside, the snow had become thicker. It fell in slow, steady waves, each flake landing as if it had all the time in the world. Number. Wind, no sound. Just the soft weight of the sky emptying itself onto the earth. The longhouse door remained closed, save for the occasional trip to the storage shed or latrine. The cold was not cruel, but it was persuasive. It encouraged stillness, and inside, the people obeyed. By mid-morning, the longhouse smelled of soaked grain, goat milk warming on the edge of the hearth, and the faint bitterness of crushed roots drying in a basket. A young mother sat nearby, braiding the hair of her sleepy daughter, who leaned against her with closed eyes. Another child played with a set of carved discs, sliding them along the floor in a quiet game passed down through generations. There were no winners, no rules spoken aloud. The game was simply something to do, something to repeat. And repetition, in winter, was its form of meaning. A man by the wall was mending a wooden sled, the kind used to haul firewood or supplies when the snow packed firm enough for travel. Though they wouldn't use it for some time, he worked patiently, binding the runners with braided leather, smoothing a splinter with a stone. His brow furrowed not from frustration, but from care. Every knot tied was a gesture of preparedness. The future would come eventually, and when it did, the sled would be ready. Just after the day's simple meal, flatbread warmed on a stone, paired with dried fish and fermented cabbage, one of the elders began speaking. He did not raise his voice or gesture with flair. He simply looked into the fire and began a story he had told before and would tell again. It was about his grandfather, who had once slept outside for 3 nights beside a sick horse to keep it warm. The story had no climax, no surprise ending. It was not told to entertain, but to remember. Memory, in this place, was not a luxury. It was a structure. A beam in the house. A log in the fire. Everyone listened, even the smallest ones, even if their minds drifted now and then. They knew the story would remain with them, whether they heard every word or not. It would return, reshaped, softened, retold. That was the nature of stories here. They moved in circles, like snow blown in gentle swirls by a tired wind. Afternoon light, faint and diffused, fell briefly through a high crack in the wall, turning the rising smoke golden for just a moment. A woman reached to hang a string of dried meat above the fire. A boy placed finished bone hooks into a leather pouch. A dog stretched from its corner and repositioned itself closer to the hearth. No voice broke the moment. It didn't need to. Everything spoke already. The crackle of the wood, the rhythm of the needles, the soft breath of sleeping children. As evening neared, a calm once again settled like snow across the household. The fire was fed, the lamps were trimmed, and the same routines began, as they always did. Furs were laid out, bowls were rinsed with melted snow, and a final round of tea was steeped from pine needles and elderflower. No one looked bored. No one looked eager. The stillness was not absence. It was present. Everything was just as it needed to be. That night, one of the older boys recited a tale he had heard as a child, of the bear who sleeps so deeply it forgets its name, and of the raven who whispers it back into its ear when spring returns. The listeners smiled softly, not at the story's magic, but at its shape, familiar, quiet, round like the moon that barely rose above the SNOWFIELDS dot, and as the last of the oil lamps flickered low, and the fire curled into its bed of coals, the people of the longhouse folded again into sleep, furs drawn to chins, arms curled around shoulders, dreams drifting upward into the beams where time and winter held them gently. The snow had thickened during the night, layering itself over everything with quiet determination. When the first few in the longhouse began to stir, they noticed it not through sight, for the windows were frosted and nearly shut with cold. But through the deeper silence pressing in from outside, the way sound had become padded and distant. The snow, in its persistent patience, had reshaped the world again. No paths would be visible now. No movement from the trees. No call from the birds. But there was no fear in this stillness. It was simply winter, continuing its slow conversation with the earth. And inside the longhouse, life responded in kind, not with urgency, but with a rhythm. The fire had barely held its heat, and so the embers were low, curled like sleeping animals beneath their bed of ash. A woman bent over them, breathing slowly, her breath rising in little clouds as she coaxed the warmth back to life. Behind her, others remained wrapped in furs, watching the way the light slowly returned, the way the dark corners of the house pulled back. The smell of burning pine needles and damp bark filled the air, the scent of another day beginning without fanfare. The smallest child whimpered in their sleep, turning toward the fire as if sensing its return before waking. Once warmth began to settle again into the space, so too did movement. A man adjusted a splint on his arm, a minor injury from the week before when hauling frozen water barrels, and a young boy quietly approached with a strip of fabric soaked in herb-steeped water. Without instruction, the boy began to rewrap. The injury, mirroring motions he had seen others perform. The man said nothing, but offered a soft nod. This was how care was passed along, not through loud instruction, but through example, through silent observation. In this way, every action within the longhouse was a kind of inheritance. Elsewhere in the long room, a pair of sisters had begun combing clumps of raw wool, laying it flat to spin into thread. Their motions were practiced and slow, arms moving, in gentle, circular gestures that mirrored the spinning wheel itself. The elder sister hummed quietly, and though her song had no words, it filled the air like steam from the cooking pot, warm, familiar, and necessary. Her little sister eventually joined in, not in harmony, but in rhythm, her voice rising slightly as she worked, and then falling again with the wheel's rotation. No one asked them to stop. The longhouse made room for such sounds. It absorbed them into its wooden bones and held them there like breath. That afternoon, someone uncovered a set of antler dice tucked away in a carved box. A few elders gathered on a thick fur rug, drawing small circles in the dust to use as play spaces. They rolled the dice with calm fingers, each toss a soft clatter against the floorboards. The game wasn't for competition. There were no prizes. It was simply another shape the hours could take, a container for laughter, for sighs, for memories shared between turns. One of the older women laughed quietly at a result, then fell silent again, her smile lingering in the lines at the corners of her eyes. Later, a pot of broth was prepared, darker than usual, brewed from bones that had simmered for many hours. The smell filled the longhouse, rich, grounding, and steady. Alongside it, barley cakes were pressed into shape and warmed on flat stones. The food was served without ceremony, ladled slowly into wooden bowls, handed from one person to the next with quiet nods and faint smiles. The act of eating together was its kind of warmth. Not every bowl held the same, but no one looked to compare. In this place, food was shared with trust, and trust was never broken as the light outside dimmed again, or perhaps never fully brightened to begin with. The household gathered for the evening's quiet. A girl recited a few lines of a remembered poem, the rhythm halting, uncertain, but sincere. Her voice wavered, and an elder gently picked up the lines where she faltered, finishing them not with grandeur, but with the calm assurance of someone who had lived the words many times before. The girl listened, eyes heavy, nodding slowly. She wouldn't forget them again. The youngest children played nearby with soft tufts of wool, shaping animals and figures they imagined from old tales. A snow bear, a sea serpent, a fox with glowing eyes. They whispered to one another about where the creatures lived, how they survived the cold. Their voices, though small, added a layer to the room's warmth, like another log added to the fire, not bright, but lasting. Before sleep, the oldest man in the longhouse was helped to a warmer place by the hearth. His bones ached in the cold, and the others gently wrapped him in 2 layers of fur, tucking the edges in close without words. He looked at each of them, eyes flickering with light and age, and said only, "Like this, we last." No one responded. They didn't need to. The phrase would stay in the air long after the fire dimmed as the night returned, thick and heavy as a wool cloak. The fire was banked, the lamps pinched closed, and each person folded into the longhouses, warmth like another timber in its frame. Outside, the snow resumed its descent, slow and soft and unbroken. The wind rose again, but not in anger, only to sing its long song across the roofs, through the trees, and into the frozen quiet beyond. And within, wrapped in the arms of winter and one another, they slept, untouched by haste, held by stillness. The snow outside no longer surprised anyone. It came as regularly as breath, as inevitable as darkness, and settled over the land like a memory, heavy, quiet, never in a rush. In the Viking longhouse, the snow was not something to be endured, but something to be acknowledged, like an old story that always returned. No matter how many times it was told, no matter how deeply it blanketed the world, it was met with calm. It was part of the rhythm. It shaped the walls, the tasks, the silences. And inside, life continued, wrapped in wool, shaped by hands long. Accustomed to waiting, morning arrived slowly, as it always did, not with sunlight, but with sound. The soft stirring of movement, the scrape of a ladle against the fire kettle, the sign of wood giving way beneath shifting weight. A child murmured in sleep and turned beneath their blanket. The hearth, now glowing again, sent faint shadows dancing up the timber beams. Each figure in the house moved like a piece of a great, slow clock, steady, unhurried, never out of sync. No one asked what day it was. Days were not numbered. They were felt. One of the young women began the morning by tending to the house's wooden charms, small tokens hanging above the door, carved in the shapes of animals, runes, and the turning sun. She wiped them gently with melted snow, her fingers brushing them not for superstition, but for tradition. These charms didn't claim to keep the snow away. They were there to remember, to mark the way time had always turned in cycles. Nearby, her grandmother sorted through a pouch of dried plants, measuring leaves for teas and poultices. Her hands, spotted with age and marked by years of spinning and grinding, moved with patient confidence. She needed no light to guide her. She had done this since her own mother's voice was still heard in the longhouse dock as the morning settled in. A low story began, not told all at once, but offered in fragments. One of the men spoke of a time when the snow was so deep that a family lived in their roof beams for 2 weeks, never touching the ground. The children asked quiet questions between spoonfuls of porridge. Could they eat up there? Did they sleep hanging like bats? The story gave no clear answers, and that was part of the pleasure. It was not told for logic. It was told because the longhouse needed a voice to fill its rafters. Like smoke, later in the morning, a wooden chest was opened, one rarely touched during the season. Inside were bundles of letters carved into bones, game pieces, and a flute made from the wing of a bird long gone from these parts. Each object was touched gently, passed hand to hand, and then returned. It was not about using them. It was about remembering they were there. Even the past was something to be maintained in winter, dusted off and gently preserved like furs and tools. One of the children blew softly across the flute. The note was quiet, broken, but sweet. No one laughed. They only nodded, as if to say, "Yes, that is the sound we remember." The afternoon passed like so many before it. A boy helped his uncle bind a cracked sled runner, watching closely how the leather was soaked first, then looped, then tightened. No speech was needed. Each knot was an explanation. Across the room, 2 women worked together to weave a wide sleeping mat, the thick reeds crackling slightly in their hands. Their motions were mirrored, each knowing when to pull, when to pause. In the quiet, someone began humming a tune old enough that even the elders had forgotten its origin. It had no beginning, no end. It simply rose, lingered, and faded. The meal. That day was stew again, but thicker now, with added mushrooms and wild onions dried from summer. Bread was warmed beside the fire, its edges crisp, its center soft. A jar of cloudberry jam, preserved at the end of autumn, was opened with care and divided into small portions. Each spoonful carried with it the taste of sun, earth, a whisper of warmth in a season ruled by frost. One girl, barely older than 6, closed her eyes while tasting hers, as if trying to remember the sound of bees. When night approached, it did so with the same gentleness as every evening before. The sky outside turned from silver to slate. Lamps were lit. The fire was encouraged to flare a little brighter. And a new story began, one not of spirits or animals, but of a woman who dreamed she became snow and drifted through her village unseen, listening to the dreams of others. As the story was told, even the adults sat with still hands, their eyes distant. When it ended, no one spoke. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was a kind of reverence. The fire was lowered, the coals banked, the youngest were helped into their sleeping nests, wrapped tightly in layers of wool and fur. The eldest leaned back into their corners, their breath audible, steady, content. And as the night filled the world again, the longhouse, with all its breath and memory, settled into sleep, as it had done the night before, and as it would the next, held safely in the arms of snow and story. The snow had grown thicker still, not in volume, but in presence, a silent force that shaped every thought, every movement, every hour. It pressed gently against the longhouse walls, climbed the rooftops, buried the footpaths, and turned the outer world into a dreamscape of white and quiet. From inside, the snow was not feared. It was accepted, even embraced, like a known elder, whose presence slowed the breath and softened every task. In the longhouse, no one fought the snow. They simply lived with it, letting it shape their days into wide, gentle arcs, their hours into warm repetitions, their nights into stories that drifted across the room like smoke. When morning arrived, it came with a kind of hush so complete that even the fire seemed to burn more slowly. The first to rise did so without a sound, brushing snow crystals from a fur-lined sleeping mat where the window slits had allowed the faintest drift to settle overnight. With practiced calm, they began tending the hearth, stirring the coals until the room began to glow again. The smell of warmth followed, of ash and dried lichen, of old wood waking once more. It spread slowly, curling around thick beams and settling into furs. A new day had begun, not suddenly, but as gently as the falling snow outside. A young boy sat near the fire, turning over a handful of smooth stones, tokens from the river, long frozen now. He placed them in careful patterns, copying the layout of the stars his uncle had once traced in the summer sky. Beside him, an older cousin observed without correcting. There was no need to point out the error. In winter, mistakes weren't problems. They were just part of learning. Nearby, a woman ground dried berries into powder to mix into a healing salve. Her hands moved with the slow rhythm of someone who'd done the same for decades, her shoulders gently swaying as if keeping time with a silent chant only she could hear. The air inside was thick with familiarity, the scent of warming broth, the whisper of woven garments shifting, the soft tapping of a spoon against a wooden bowl. Outside, the snow fell without pause, undisturbed even by the smallest breeze. In the distance, a single raven passed overhead, its wings the only movement against the sky. Its cry did not echo, but was absorbed, taken into the folds of winter's hush. Mid-morning was devoted to weaving. Several women and girls gathered near the fire to work on a thick wall hanging, not decorative, but functional. It would be layered across the coldest part of the house, keeping wind from slipping in at the floorboards. Still, patterns were added. Simple spirals, symbols for protection, shapes borrowed from the memory of flowers. Beauty, even in its smallest form, was never wasted in a Viking winter. The girls asked what each shape meant, and the elders answered. With quiet certainty, some symbols were for luck, others for remembrance, but most were simply there, because they always had been dot at midday. The house quieted once more for a meal. The stew had thickened overnight, and the addition of dried mushrooms gave it a depth that seemed to echo the low rumble of the hearth. Each bowl was handed with care. Each bite is taken with mindfulness. No one hurried. In winter, food was not just sustenance. It was proof that summer had existed, that the world had once been green and would be again. A girl asked what green looked like, and an old man laughed softly. "It's like soft snow that sings," he said. She didn't understand, but nodded anyway. Later, a man fetched a small harp from a corner, simple and made of willow, its strings thin and worn, but still musical. He tuned it slowly, plucking each note with care, letting the sound hang in. Be air. It was not a performance. No one clapped. He simply played, and the notes drifted like flakes through the stillness, joining the room's rhythm. A woman hummed in response, a tune older than her voice, matching the harp's slow, rising melody. Their duet was quiet, almost imperceptible. A lullaby not meant to end, but to settle softly into the floor, and beams dot as the dim light faded once more into shadow. The house shifted toward rest. A child traced circles in the condensation on the window slit, watching the sky darken without drama. Two boys played a wordless game, balancing pebbles on the edge of a stool to see how many could stand before falling. A woman stitched a new glove from sealskin, occasionally pausing to stretch her fingers. And above it all, the fire continued, as it always had, never roaring, never fading entirely. Just present. Evening was marked by a story. Tonight's came from a visiting cousin who had arrived 2 days before and spoken little since. Now she sat cross-legged by the fire and told of a tree made of bones that grew beneath the ice and whispered dreams to those who slept near it. No one asked questions. They only listened. The children leaned close. The adults closed their eyes. The tale unspooled like wool, soft and endless, filling the room with imagined snow and slow-growing branches dot as the lamps were dimmed and sleep returned like a tide. As snow outside thickened once more. Its fall was silent, absolute, and certain. But the longhouse was ready, tucked beneath fur and timber, wrapped in stories and breath and steady warmth. It endured, not with defiance, but with calm. The world had stilled again, and within it they dreamed not of escape, but of continuity. The snow had shaped the land into smooth, curving forms, no edges, no corners, only gentle hills and low drifts that looked as though they had never been walked upon. In truth, few feet had touched the world beyond the longhouse in many days. There was no need. Everything the villagers required was within reach or had been prepared long before the first flake had fallen. Winter was not a season of seeking, but of staying, of trusting in what was stored, what was known, what had been carefully built across warmer moons. Inside the longhouse, this trust echoed through every gesture, every quiet word, every slow, shared breath. The morning began, as always, with silence. Not because silence was required, but because it was understood. The fire stirred beneath its ash covering, returning to life with a little encouragement. Warm water was poured into wooden cups. A wool blanket was lifted from a sleeping child and folded without a word. Eyes opened gradually. Movements stretched across minutes. The day, like the season, unfolded slowly and with care. A man sat sharpening a set of bone-tipped needles, running his whetstone with smooth, even strokes. These were not weapons, not tools of war or defense. They were used for sewing hides, stitching fur, and repairing the thick cloaks that wrapped around shoulders like second skins. His task was not grand, but it was necessary, and in winter, the necessary became sacred. A woman nearby twisted sinew into thin thread, her fingers moving automatically while her thoughts wandered elsewhere. Between them, the silence was not awkward. It was companionable, the kind that forms only when people have shared enough days to no longer need to fill the space between with sound. Mid-morning passed beneath, the soft glow of the fire and the filtered gray of the outside light. A young boy practiced his letters on a waxed wooden board, copying runes that had been scratched by his father, his grandfather, and likely his great-grandfather before him. He held the stylus with both hands for steadiness, his brow furrowed, in quiet determination. Now and then he glanced up, not for praise, but for reassurance. A slow nod from his uncle was all he needed to continue. Others worked nearby, weaving rushes into mats, shaping soapstone into small figurines, stitching tears in old slippers. Every act held a memory. Every object, no matter how small or humble, was made with fingers that understood how to outlast the snow. Even the worn floorboards beneath their feet bore the marks of this long patience, smoothed by years of footsteps, darkened by firelight and time-dotted midday. The household shared a soup of boiled grains, bits of dried turnip, and thin slices of smoked fish. The broth was thin but warming, and each bowl was accepted with hands already warmed from the hearth. A girl offered her portion to her grandmother first, as was the custom. The older woman accepted it with a soft look, then handed the bowl back, half full with a whisper, "Enough for both of us." It wasn't a lesson. It was simply the way things were done. After the meal, the house quieted again, not into sleep, but into a different kind of restfulness. Some sat and worked. Others watched. A few simply sat. There was no guilt in stillness. No pressure to produce. Winter allowed for watching the fire for an hour and considering it time well spent. A boy whittled a bird from driftwood, and showed it to his sister. She nodded solemnly and wrapped it in a scrap of cloth, placing it beside their sleeping area without a word. It would become part of the house now, one more thing quietly present in the background of each day. Later, a pair of cousins ventured. Outside, bundled thickly in wool and fur, their snowshoes creaking under each step. They walked a short distance to check on a half-buried storage bin, ensuring the latches were still fastened and the snow had not crept too deep inside. The cold bit at their cheeks, but they moved without urgency. They spoke only a few words. The snow absorbed most of them. When they returned, their eyelashes were frosted and their boots, steamed near the hearth as they dried, that evening returned with its usual softness. The room glowed gently, not from brightness, but from comfort. Lamps were lit with careful hands. A woman braided dried grasses into a coil, a baby sleeping on her back. Someone handed out warm stones wrapped in a cloth to tuck beside sleeping places. One by one, the tasks of the day were folded and put away as though tucking the house itself in for the night. A story was shared before sleep, not a tale of warriors or gods, but of a quiet village that once slept so deeply through winter that no one spoke for 3 months. A child asked, "Did they forget how to speak?" And the storyteller smiled, answering only, "They remembered everything that mattered." The children considered this and slowly nodded. The answer was enough dot, and as the fire curled into its final shape, and the longhouse filled with slow breaths and soft dreams, the snow outside resumed its gentle descent. It felt like ash. It felt like time. And the longhouse, buried deeper, now beneath winter's hush, remained steady, a heart still beating in the center of a sleeping world. The snow had begun to lean into the house now, not menacingly, but with weight. It pressed softly against the outer walls, rose high along the eaves, and muffled every creak of the surrounding trees. The longhouse didn't fight it. It yielded slightly, just as it had every winter for as long as anyone could remember. Snow shaped the shape of living, thickening the walls with silence, slowing speech, and settling thought like dust in an undisturbed room. And within that gentle weight, the longhouse became a place beyond mere shelter. It became memory, breath, warmth, a slow-beating heart in the middle of a frozen world. When the fire was stirred that morning, its coals were deep red, still alive after the long, quiet night. The woman who tended it did so without gloves, her calloused hands impervious to the ash and cold. As she moved the kindling into place, she paused once, listening, not to sound, but to the absence of it. The silence was so full, it seemed to. It wasn't empty. It was thick with the presence of the snow, the walls, the breath of sleeping bodies, the slow rhythm of another day arriving without need for alarm. The first child to rise stepped softly, still wrapped in a woolen shawl. He sat near the hearth and pressed his bare toes against a warm stone, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Soon others followed, one by one, gathering not from summons, but from instinct, from the quiet pull of light and heat and the comforting scent of morning porridge already thickening over the fire. The longhouse didn't wake all at once. It unfurled. Today, someone decided to clean the bones. Not from fresh food, that was rare now, but from the stores of carved and shaped. Bones saved for tools, for handles, for spindle whorls. A man laid them out beside the hearth on a cloth of worn linen, sorting them by size and use. Beside him, a girl picked up one with careful fingers and ran a bit of sand across its side, revealing the smoothness underneath. There was no rush. The snow outside ensured there would be time. All the time needed dot not far off. A boy held a bowl of cloudy water and stared into it, watching the way the steam curled upward and vanished before reaching the ceiling. When his mother asked what he was thinking, he answered only, "It looks like souls." She didn't ask more. In the long, Winters, people learned to speak only when needed, and to accept silence as its kind of answer. She sat beside him and handed him a spoon. They shared the bowl, dipping alternately, never spilling. Later in the morning, an elder took down a bundle of charms tied together with sinew cord. They were simple things, bits of carved wood, tiny stones with holes worn through, fragments of iron so old no one remembered their purpose. He placed them on a fur mat and began to speak, not a story this time, but a recounting. A memory of a winter when the snow had collapsed a roof in the next valley, and a group of men, including his brother, had walked for 2 days to help rebuild it. He spoke of the way they packed food into their cloaks, the way their boots had to be cut off with knives when they arrived. He wasn't telling it to impress. He was just remembering. And everyone listened, because that's what made the memory real again. As the day wore on, the air inside thickened with the scent of juniper, smoke, and drying skins. Someone was repairing mittens, sealskin lined with wool, and another was reshaping the wooden stays of a snowshoe. These tasks required no special focus. Hands moved automatically. The mind was allowed to wander. A woman near the door began, whispering an old chant, her voice low, almost lost beneath the soft scratch of a sharpening stone nearby. Her voice wasn't meant for others. It was for the house, for the spirits that lived in the beams, for the snow itself, perhaps. The chant didn't ask for protection. It offered gratitude. The meal came with no announcement, just the natural pause in the day that marked the time for sharing. Dried peas softened in broth, strips of cured elk meat, and a few slices of dense black bread. The food was passed with hands that had long ago memorized each other's reach. A child dropped a piece of bread, and her brother retrieved it without teasing, brushing it off, and handing it back with a quiet nod. That was how things were done. Not because they were taught, but because they were remembered. As dusk crept through the window slits, shadows gathered early. The house glowed from within, not brightly, but warmly, amber firelight licking the walls, reflecting in carved cups, dancing on closed eyelids. A woman placed warm stones wrapped in cloth at the base of each sleeping area. Another brought out a basket of carved figures and arranged them in a circle for the children to play. The figures were old, worn smooth by generations of small hands, but each had a name, and each name carried a story. Before sleep, a man recited a poem. No one asked him to. He simply began. The words moved like the snow itself, slow, rhythmic, timeless. They spoke of frost-covered hills and dreams of green fields, of the breath of trees under snow, and of silence that remembers every footstep. When he finished, no one spoke. They simply let the words hang in the smoke-thickened air until they dissolved into the night. And when sleep came, it came like it always did, layer by layer, breath by breath, beneath furs and beside embers, while the snow pressed gently against the outside walls. There was no fear, only stillness, only warmth, only the quiet knowing that this was how winter lived, not in waiting for it to pass, but in letting it hold you, softly, completely, like a lullaby with no end. By the time the next day arrived, if it could be called a new day at all, the world outside had vanished entirely into snow. There were no shapes on the horizon, no lines to divide land from sky. Everything was white, and the white was endless, not blinding, but soft, as if the entire world had taken a long breath and decided not to speak again until the thaw. Inside the longhouse, no one noticed the loss of the horizon. They hadn't looked for it in weeks. Their world existed within these walls, beneath this roof, and in the soft flicker of firelight that had never once gone out. Winter did not need to be measured by change. It was measured by warmth, by routine, and by the number of nights safely passed. The fire crackled just enough to mark the hour, if hours were still worth counting. It was neither morning nor evening. It was simply now. A woman stirred a pot of thickened porridge, adding a bit of honey scraped from the bottom of a beeswax jar. The smell was comforting, sweet, smoky, familiar. She hummed a few notes of a melody older than her voice, and the steam from the pot curled upward like a ribbon, dancing briefly before dissolving into the rafters. The longhouse held its breath in a kind of contentment, everything perfectly in place, just as it had been yesterday, and the day before that, and as it would tomorrow. One of the boys was fashioning a small sled from wood offcuts and sinew, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. He wasn't building it for use, not yet, but as a gift for his younger cousin, a game to pass time, a gesture to say, "We're still here." Beside him, an elder offered quiet suggestions, not spoken, but shown by guiding the boys. Hands or tapping once at a crooked joint. The boy adjusted his work, not hurriedly, but patiently. In this season, nothing that mattered could be rushed. A pair of girls stitched together patches of cloth into a new quilted mat, laughing softly between each pull of the thread. They weren't telling jokes. They were just laughing at nothing, at everything, at the weight of the air and the closeness of the room. Even laughter here was slow. It didn't burst. It drifted. Across the fire, a dog lay curled in sleep, its paws twitching in dreams. The only other sound was the occasional snap from the firewood, a low reminder that the hearth still lived. The hours stretched without shape, folding gently over one another like layers of wool. Someone began whittling a spoon. Someone else braided. A leather cord for a harness. A woman sorted through herbs stored in a hanging basket, selecting bits of dried valerian and pine. She crushed them into a small wooden cup and handed it to an older man whose cough had deepened with the season. He accepted it without words, sipping slowly, the warmth easing into his chest. Gratitude didn't need to be spoken. It moved through. Glances, gestures, and the offer of an extra fur at night. At the edge of the room, a little girl stared into the fire with such stillness that she looked like part of the furniture. When asked what she was thinking, she replied, "I'm listening to the snowfall." No one corrected her. They nodded because they too had heard it, not with their ears, but in the bones of the house, in the hush that filled the spaces between the crackles and the sighs. Snowfall, in its purest form, had a voice. And those who stayed long enough, in winter, learned to hear it. Food was shared without division. A pot of root stew and bits of dried meat, served from the center, passed from hand to hand. Each person took only what they needed. The smallest child was fed first, then the oldest, then the rest. There were no commands, only knowing. This was the rhythm of winter, a kindness practiced not for praise, but because it was what survival had shaped into custom. As the day dimmed, the sky outside took on a shade of blue, so deep it nearly turned gray, the color of sleep itself. A boy peeked outside, just long enough to shake snow from the path to the latrine. When he returned, flakes clung to his eyebrows like frost jewels. He was silent, but grinning. The house welcomed him back with warmth and wool and a place by the fire. That evening, someone spoke of dreams, not the kind you chase, but the kind that visit without warning. One woman said she had dreamed of moss underfoot, soft and green, and the sound of bees again. A man admitted he had dreamed of rowing down a river so calm it reflected the moon like a second world. These dreams weren't mourned. They were shared, and then folded away like stories too fragile to leave in the cold. Sleep arrived not as an event, but as a tide. One by one, they drifted off. A head nodding forward, a hand going still mid-stitch, a sigh echoing from the shadows. The house dimmed slowly, lamps covered, embers tucked beneath ash. Outside, the snow continued, endless and delicate, reshaping the same landscape over and over again. But inside, nothing changed. And that was the comfort, the stillness, the peace. And so they slept beneath layers of fur and memory, between the same walls, on the same floor, surrounded by the same quiet breath of winter. The longhouse did not change. It endured, and in doing so, it cradled the people within, as gently and silently as the snow cradled the earth dot by now. The snow outside had grown so high along the longhouse walls that even the narrow slits cut, for light, were buried in white. The world had become a cave of frost, soft, dense, absolute. It was neither threatening nor ominous. It simply was. Winter, at this depth, asked for nothing except acceptance. And inside the longhouse, the people answered with silence, with slowness, and with gentle repetition. There were no longer questions about the length of the season, no musings about when the sun might return. All of that had faded. In its place was something calmer, the steady presence of now, the rhythm of breath and fire, and the warm pulse of shared space. The fire was slow to rise that morning. The coals, though protected through the night, responded sluggishly, like dreams unwilling to let go. A woman crouched low, breathing gently into the ash, her hair falling forward in loose braids. Behind her, the house was still mostly asleep. Only a few stirred, someone shifting beneath a fur, another reaching toward their boots, with one arm still wrapped in a blanket. No one spoke. The fire was always first. It led the house. Its voice returned first, its warmth followed, and then came the day. When the fire was lit fully, light began to return in patches, golden flickers stretching long fingers across the floor, up the walls, and into the rafters. Smoke twisted upward, curling among the herbs and dried fish that hung from the ceiling beams. A young boy reached into a clay jar to pull out a handful of berries, dried almost to powder. He placed them into a carved cup and poured warm water over them. This was not a recipe. It was a memory. He had seen his grandmother do the same each morning before her knees stiffened with cold. Now, with her sleeping quietly nearby, he did it without being asked. A pair of men opened the door briefly, clearing a narrow channel to the outside world. The cold rushed in like a wave, silent and sharp, curling around ankles and flicking at noses. But it was welcomed for just a breath, a reminder that the world still existed out there, even if it was buried and still. They moved a few things. Inside, firewood, a bundle of frozen hides, then closed the door again, returning to the warmth and softness of the hearth's breath. The snow had stacked nearly shoulder high. That, too, was normal. A woman, her hair streaked with gray, began preparing a healing balm. Her hands moved carefully as she crushed dried nettle, ground resin into a fine dust, and warmed a mixture of tallow and beeswax over the fire. The scent filled the house, sharp, herbal, comforting. It clung to everything, weaving itself into cloaks, hair, and memory. She didn't speak while she worked, but when she was finished, she offered the salve to each pair of hands in turn. Cracked, calloused fingers soothed gently with her creation. Even the dog received a smear behind its ears. Care, in winter, was not reserved for the sick. It was for everyone. Later in the day, someone retrieved a rolled mat from behind the food stores and spread it near the fire. Upon it, they laid thin strips of bark, dried leaves, bits of antlers, and string. Without instructions, the children gathered around. They began crafting, not toys, not tools, but small figures and strange animals, things made from imagination rather than memory. One child made a snow spirit with pinicone eyes. Another shaped a long, coiled dragon from willow bark. The adults did not interrupt. They watched and they remembered what it was like to dream of creatures not yet named Dot as the house warmed fully. The light within took on a kind of rhythm. Reflections danced on the copper of kettles. Shadows stretched and shifted like stories being remembered. A woman sang softly while stirring a thickened broth, her voice not clear, not loud, but rich with quiet sorrow and warmth. Her song had no beginning, no end. It folded into the house like steam into air. A man sat polishing an old blade, though it had not seen use in months. It was not a weapon for war, but a tool for shaping wood, slicing hides, and carving moles. He moved the cloth across the metal slowly, as if in meditation, not to prepare, but to honor. Objects held memory here, not for what they had done, but for how they had been held, used, respected. Even stillness became sacred when repeated enough times. As evening approached, the snow outside began to glisten faintly, touched by a sliver of light low on the horizon. Not quite sun, but a blush of something not gray. It slipped through. A small gap in the wall, casting a golden thread across the floor. No one spoke of it, but several paused to look. The light was not hope. It was a gift. A brief moment of beauty that needed no explanation. Dinner was quiet as always. A shared bowl of thick porridge, strips of fish softened with broth, and a few dried berries placed carefully on each child's portion. Gratitude moved through glances. One child leaned against her mother's side, sleepy even as she chewed. Another played with a wooden spoon, tracing patterns in the steam that rose from the food. That night, the storyteller was an old woman with fingers curled from age and voice so soft it barely reached the edges of the room. She spoke of a bear who slept so deeply beneath the mountain that when it awoke, the stars had moved. The story meandered. No urgency, no twist, just a quiet unfolding of winter's patience. By the time it ended, several had already slipped into sleep, their heads resting on woven mats, their hands curled around warm stones, and once again the fire was lowered, the lamps dimmed, and the longhouse became a single breathing creature, heavy with rest, surrounded by snow, filled with warmth. Outside, the snow continued. Inside, the stillness deepened as the season held them gently in place, asking nothing more than to stay. The snow no longer fell in gusts or sheets. It drifted, slowly, endlessly, as if the sky had forgotten how to stop giving. Layer upon layer, it piled around the longhouse, turning the once defined land into a smooth, pale dream. From within, time itself had begun to change. Not vanish, but dissolve, like a trace of herbs in hot water. Days and nights blurred, names softened, and the stories spoken in the low firelight began to sound less like memory and more like myth. The longhouse, with its thick beams and breathing walls, had become a vessel, not just for warmth, but for something deeper, a place where people lived not only with one another, but with the echo of every winter that had come before. Morning, the youngest of the group woke first. He did not stir the fire or make a sound. He simply sat upright and stared at the rafters. There, in the shifting glow of an ember, shadows danced. Familiar shapes, bird wings, antlers, the curve of a woman's braid. He watched them like old friends, as though they were waiting to speak. Eventually, someone joined him and placed a fur over his shoulders. No questions, just presence. That was the way of winter, connection without explanation. Someone sang while folding the morning furs, a wordless tune passed down through generations. It was not a song for others to hear. It was for the house, a vibration through wood and skin and smoke. Outside, the wind moved like breath across the snow's surface, sculpting small hills and dips with hands unseen. A woman added dry moss to the hearth, sweetening the scent of the fire. The coals sighed in gratitude. A child sat cross-legged by the wall, carving a small face into a block of wood. It was round, soft, with closed eyes. When asked who it was, she shrugged and said, "Maybe an old winter." The others nodded. That was enough. In this place, things did not need to be exact. Faces were symbols, not likenesses. Stories were memories, even when no one knew who first told them. A man repaired a woven fishing net with careful hands, even though the river had long since vanished beneath ice. His hands moved out of habit. The rhythm itself was worth preserving. He did not look up when a woman placed a bowl beside him, a thin broth with roots and herbs. He touched her arm once in thanks, then continued his stitching. Nourishment came in many forms. Later, several gathered around a bundle wrapped in old cloth. Inside were relics: a flint striker, a bent ring, a carved bone comb, and a small square of fabric with a symbol embroidered into its center. Each item was held in turn, not examined with curiosity, but remembered in silence. No one spoke of who had once owned them. They simply passed them from hand to hand, feeling the weight, the wear, the stillness. Objects were stories here. They held more than purpose. They held presence. Near midday, someone opened the ceiling vent to let the smoke rise freely. A single shaft of faint light broke through, illuminating a spot on the floor. The children gathered to play in it, pretending it was a path or a bridge or a secret river that only showed itself once per day. Their laughter was hushed but alive, like sparrows darting through a still forest. The adults let them be. Play was wholly in the season of survival. When hunger came again, it arrived quietly. No one declared it. One person set the kettle back over the flame, cut thick slices of salted fish. A third portion of dried grains was put into a bowl and stirred with the back of a spoon. The room filled with the sound of slow preparation, the soft clink of ladles, the hush of furs being laid out, the fire cracking open a knot in a piece of pine. They ate together, as always, leaning into one another in subtle ways, a hand resting on a shoulder, a foot tucked under a parent's cloak. That evening, the storyteller was the quietest man in the house. His voice, when it came, was thin as a reed and barely louder than the wind. He told of a time when wolves used to follow the houses in winter, drawn by the smell of cooking meat and the heat of belief. Not to hunt, but to listen. He said the wolves were once men returned in fur, wandering the dark edges of snow to find songs they'd lost. No one interrupted him. When he finished, no one asked what the story meant. It was enough that it had been told. As the final embers settled low in the hearth, a woman near the wall reached out and touched one of the beams above her head. She closed her eyes and whispered a name, not someone who lived now, but someone who had once sat in that same place, wrapped in that same fur. The beam had heard it before. The longhouse, too, remembered. And so the night returned once more, not as an ending, but as a return to warmth, to rest, to the hush that only the deepest parts of winter could know. Outside, the snow gathered again. Inside, the people folded into sleep, carrying the weight of countless winters in their bones. And the longhouse held them, every one, like a breath that never left Dot by now. Even the idea of seasons seemed distant, like a tale told by travelers who had long since stopped arriving. There was only this deep, unbroken winter, wrapped so completely around the longhouse that it felt less like weather and more like a state of being. The snow no longer startled anyone, but inspired comment. It was simply there, like the walls, like the breath inside a chest. And as the cold pressed in ever more closely, the people within didn't fight it. They adjusted, they softened. Their movements became slower, not out of weariness, but because there was no need to rush. Everything important in winter was quiet. Body itself began to listen. Feet moved carefully, conserving warmth. Hands moved with intention, never flinching at the frost that crept near the walls. The skin learned to read the air for temperature before stepping near the door. People woke in waves, not to the demands of a clock, but to the subtle shifts in light and warmth, the turning of someone in their furs, the scent of broth warming on the coals, the faint creak of a log settling in the roof above. These were the clocks of winter. These were enough. That morning, a young woman sat near the center of the house, weaving a net from strips of dried grass and old sinew. It wasn't needed for fishing yet, but her fingers needed a purpose. With each loop and knot, she told no one in particular that she dreamed of the river's surface thawing, the ice breaking like glass, the sun touching the water once again. No one interrupted her. They let her speak while she worked. Dreaming. In these months was an act of courage. Nearby, an elder man was grinding roots into powder with a smooth stone. He said nothing. He hadn't spoken in days, not out of silence, but because his role no longer required words. His presence, his patience, the smell of the ground root, all spoke for him. When he finished, he added the powder to a pouch and handed it to a young girl, who tucked it into a row of small bags suspended by a wooden peg. Her hands lingered there, brushing over the others. Each pouch had a story. Each carried warmth in a darker corner. A mother gently combed her child's hair with carved bone teeth, separating knots with fingers and soft murmurs. The child sat still, eyes half closed, lulled by the rhythm. The sound of the comb through hair was almost like the sound of snow falling, soft, steady, unspoken. The mother hummed an old tune, not sung, just a vibration from chest to hand, passed into the crown of the child's head. It was not a lullaby. It was a thread, connecting now to before, one season to the last. That day's food was humble, mashed root vegetables and fermented cabbage, served with bits of dried meat softened in broth. It was the same as the day before, and the day before that, but no one complained. The sameness was its kind of comfort. Hunger had become a quiet thing, never desperate, never gnawing. It was managed like the cold, like the dark, always present, never dominating. And because of that, every bite mattered. A boy sat shaping a bone into the rough outline of a spoon. It would take him weeks to smooth the handle, to carve the bowl, to sand it fine enough for lips. But time was abundant, and patience was everywhere. He worked carefully, tracing the edge with his thumbnail, checking the curve with his eyes alone. Around him, others worked too, mending cloaks, cleaning tools, softening leather. The quiet industry of survival filled the room like breath. Unhurried, unspoken, necessary. Outside, the snow sighed against the longhouse walls, muffling the world. A brief gust shook the roof timbers, loosening a small cascade of powder that fell silently just outside the threshold. Inside, a dog perked its ears, then lowered its head again, unbothered. The house creaked but held. It had done so for many winters. It would continue to do so. As twilight folded in, not quite night, but the pale dimness that passed for evening. A woman near the back of the house lit a small oil lamp. She shielded the flame with her hand until it steadied, then placed it near a woven wall mat that depicted a bear standing on hind legs, surrounded by stars. It wasn't art. It was a memory. The bear, the stars, the position of its feet, all meant something, though no one quite remembered the original tale. Still, they watched it as the flicker of the lamp made the bear dance. The past, like the snow, always found its way back. That night, no one told the full story. Instead, small pieces were shared. A dream someone had of walking through grass tall. As men, a whisper of a song half remembered from a grandmother's mouth. A moment recalled from a summer long ago when the lake steamed in the morning and birds called through the mist. Each memory was set gently in the room like another log on the fire, adding warmth, not noise. Sleep came as it always did, quietly, folding one person after another into rest. A child curled against her mother's side. A man turned slowly on, his straw mat exhaling with contentment. The dog shifted once, then stilled, and the longhouse dimmed again, its breath slowing, its heart warm. The snow outside pressed closer still, sealing them into silence, not with fear, but with care. And in that quiet, the people slept, not just through the night, but through the weight of winter itself, dreaming not of escape, but of continuity, of staying, of holding still beneath the snow and being held in return. As the moon turned slowly behind the clouds, casting barely a breath of light across the snow-blanketed world, the longhouse remained unchanged in its slumbering rhythm. But within that quiet, something else had begun to stir, not in urgency, but in remembrance. It was in the way someone touched the doorframe with their fingers before stepping out, in the way another paused at the hearth to straighten a carved stone, in the way the names of the dead were whispered as breaths, not words. For in winters such as these, when time folds in on itself and the living grow still, the ancestors come closer, not to haunt, but to accompany. That morning began like so many others, with fire coaxed from coals and bodies rising slowly from furs. But there was a difference in the air. Not colder, not heavier, just older, the kind of quiet that holds stories. A woman placed a carved bowl at the far end of the hearth, filled it with dried berries and a splash of broth, and did not speak. No one touched it. It was not for them. It was for the ones who had come before, the ones who had sat in these very places, breathed the same air, laughed and grieved and vanished into soil and sky. A child, curious, pointed at the bowl, and his father only smiled, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "They eat with us when we remember them," he said, "and they keep the wind gentle when we do." The boy nodded as if this made perfect sense. And in a place like this, it did. Later, an old man sat with his legs crossed, holding a strip of cloth worn nearly to threads. He ran his fingers over the weave slowly, eyes unfocused. When asked what it was, he only said, "My mother wore it when she sang to the sea." That was all. The cloth was returned to its pouch and placed near his bed, where it would stay, untouched until the next time memory rose like mist from the coals. The house took on a slower stillness that day. Fewer words were spoken. Fewer tasks were assigned. Instead, people moved gently, not from fatigue, but from reverence. The snow outside had settled perfectly, not a flake in motion, and the trees beyond the longhouse stood frozen in place like carved sentries. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, listening. Midday brought a simple meal, roasted tubers with melted fat, shared from a wide stone plate. But before the first bite was taken, a moment of silence was held. Not long, just a breath, enough to let memory settle at the table. Then came the eating, slow, grateful, almost ceremonial. Even the children ate without chatter, sensing something in the hush that hung in the smoke. Later, a woman began to hum, not a song of play or warmth, but a funeral chant, not for sorrow, but for connection. A tune passed down through generations, worn smooth by time and tears. Her voice did not rise. It meandered like a stream under ice, quiet but constant. As she sang, a few others joined her, one by one, until the air shimmered with tone, low and ancient. It was not a performance. It was a reminder. Someone added herbs to the fire, sage, juniper, dried apple skin, and the smoke turned fragrant, curling around rafters and coats, slipping into hair and fur, softening everything. A dog near the door lifted its head, sniffed, and lay back down with a sigh. It even seemed to understand that this was not an ordinary day. As twilight deepened, a boy asked if the spirits of the dead could see them through the snow. His grandmother nodded slowly. They see what we do with what they left us. The snow only softens their gaze. The boy smiled, then went back to tracing patterns in the frost on the wall. Behind him, the firelight flickered against the carved wooden posts, shadows moving like familiar hands. That evening, no story was told aloud. Instead, people sat in a loose circle, each holding an item from those who had passed: a knife, a thread, a comb, a folded note. There were no explanations, no declarations. Just the quiet act of holding, of remembering through the fingers. What the heart already knew. One woman wept silently, not out of pain, but from the soft weight of love that doesn't leave. As night settled fully, and the wind returned in whispers, a final log was placed upon the fire. A man stood and spoke. A name into the flame, just one, and then stepped back. No one responded. No one needed to. The name had been carried, and the fire had heard it. And as sleep came once again to the longhouse, it came not as escape, but as embrace, wrapping the living and the dead in the same warmth, the same breath, the same stillness. Outside, the snow continued to guard the world. Inside, time curled in upon itself like a sleeping hand. The ancestors were near, and the people rested. The final days of deepest winter came without ceremony. There were no signs, no great thaw, no moment of change. But those inside the longhouse felt it in the bones. A subtle softening, a shift in the breath of the wind, a quiet hope that didn't speak its name. The snow outside was still high, the ice still firm upon the river, but something beneath. It all had turned. And so the people remained in their rhythm, not because they had to, but because it was right. Winter was still present, but its grip had loosened just enough to let memory stretch. The longhouse, after so many nights of breath and silence and fire, had become more than shelter. It was a world of its own, a place that listened, that held the dreams of those inside without spilling a drop. Every creak of the beams, every hiss of sap in the hearth, every sigh beneath fur and wool had shaped its soul. This house was not only built from trees and clay and bone, but from quiet moments, the laughter under blankets, the songs sung to no one, the hands holding broth bowls, the hush of children's footsteps across the floor. A woman awoke before dawn and placed her palms on the cold earth just inside the threshold. Her breath came slowly, fogging in the half-light, as she whispered a blessing that only the house could hear. Not for luck, not for change, just for stillness, for peace. Others soon followed in their ways. A man repaired a cracked wooden bowl, not because it would be needed tomorrow, but because it had once belonged to his brother. A child polished a stone until it gleamed, then set it on a shelf beside a dried braid of wildflower steam. A grandmother traced a symbol on the wall, an old mark, then closed her eyes and pressed her forehead to the wood. They spoke little. They listened more. And in the rhythm of shared silence, something stronger than sound moved between them. As the fire rose again, casting warm gold along the backs of sleeping forms, someone added spruce needles and a sliver of beeswax. The room brightened in scent, sweet, earthy, evergreen. It was a smell of remembering and returning, of roots beneath snow and sunlight hidden in bark. The coals welcomed it gently, crackling without urgency. A boy wandered to the door and cracked it open a finger's width. Outside, the sky had turned from black to slate, and the stars were beginning to fade. No sunrise yet, but a promise. He didn't step through. He just looked. Snow still lay thick, undisturbed, and the trees still bent beneath its weight, but there was a feeling in the air, like something had exhaled. He closed the door again softly, as if not to startle the stillness. Inside, breakfast came in the same way it always had, not as a rush, not as a task, but as a gift. Bowls of mashed roots with slivers of fish, bits of dried fruit, and a touch of sweetened broth passed hand to hand. Steam curled from the bowls like breath from ancient mouths. No one filled their dish. They filled each other's. And as they ate, they did not speak of the end of winter. They had learned that things changed only when they were ready. Words could not rush the thaw. That night, for the first time in many weeks, someone asked for a tale. A young girl with hair like braided straw curled her knees beneath her cloak and looked at the oldest man in the house. "Tell us the story of the star that waited in the snow," she said. And he smiled, slow, deep, eyes soft. He began, not with words, but with a hum. And then the story followed, of a light that refused to burn out, of a sky that never stopped watching, of a single spark that once found its way into the heart of a sleeping bear and kept it dreaming through the longest night. The others listened, not only with their ears, but with their breath, their hands, their closeness. The story was not new, but tonight it sounded different, not because it had changed, but because they had. When sleep finally gathered them, it did so with a gentler hand. The fire burned low. The dog near the door stirred and let out a long, contented breath. One by one, bodies curled into the rhythm of dreaming. The longhouse, now wrapped once again in quiet, seemed to pulse softly with warmth. A heartbeat beneath snow outside, the wind slowed. The trees stood tall. The stars shifted behind cloud veils, patient as ever. And the snow, ancient and knowing, watched over it all, not to judge, but to preserve. For in this place, beneath firs and fire and memory, the people had not merely survived winter. They had become part of it. And in the deep hush of that final night, the longhouse slept. The story ends here, but the winter, the silence, the warmth, and the breath of the ancestors remain.